Welcome to Career Tools, our guidance on speaking the language. Here we go. Folks, this podcast answers the questions. Why should I try to speak the language when I work abroad? How can I learn the language when I'm working abroad? And what difference does speaking the language make when I'm overseas working abroad? If your knowledge of DISC, high D's, I's, S's, and C's, the perfectionists, the Attila the Huns, the marketers, the team players, if that has helped you become more effective at work, you'll want to seriously consider coming to our Effective Communications Conference. We set the basics of DISC in an hour or so, and then we spend the rest of the day teaching you how finally to communicate effectively, which is to pay attention to what your listener does and communicate in a way that makes sense to them. At the end of the day, you'll be able to read someone in a conversation, determine their major DISC tendency, and then based on that, make some changes in how you deliver to improve the chances that you get harmony and congruence and collaboration and not drama, conflict, and tension. Come see us. So when we've talked about this before, we've hinted at it. We've never done a full series on expats, on international work and so on, which is becoming increasingly common. But we recommend when you're overseas, however length of time, a week, a month, 6 months, whatever, we recommend you endeavor to learn the language of the country or the nation or region that you're living in. It's not just about the words. It's about respect, I think. I mean, how many Americans have probably lost a little bit of respect over the last 100 years because they didn't speak the language, and yet our European friends, as an example, speak 2, 3, and 4 languages, which to some degree makes sense in Europe with the proximity of other nations and different languages. But nevertheless, I think the American person from the U.S. who goes overseas and doesn't speak language is essentially saying, I don't speak yours, but you need to speak mine. And there are many Americans who are lucky that others are smarter than us and speak the language.
And before we freak everybody out and they stop listening, we're not talking actually about fluency.
No, yes.
We're talking about at a level that's commensurate with how long you're there. So if you're only there for a week, you probably only need a few words. If you're there for a month, and a few more, and so on.
Yeah, obviously. And to me, in the back of my mind, Wendy, it's much more about effort.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
I remember the joke once about how I love German, the language, studied it for 4 years in high school, and then regret studying Russian at the military academy. I wish I had taken more German and really pushed to be not fluent, but much more knowledgeable. I can get around in Germany today, but I can't be in a business conversation. But I'll never forget a writer once saying, the problem with the German language, which because I learned it in high school, I was kind of okay with this, is that if you're listening to someone in German and it's not your first language, when they go into the store, you can't tell whether or not they bought some ham or killed somebody until the very end of the sentence, because the verb tends to happen later than in American English. And I think that's important in terms of understanding. Look, the same guy, one of my favorite writers, said, you cannot think what you cannot say. To learn another language is not just to show respect, but to understand how they think. So we've got an outline here, some guidance. Go.
So try to speak the language. Use all the opportunities. Watch and listen. Mistakes are inevitable.
And are okay, right?
And are okay, absolutely. And treat it as a game.
Yeah, I'll tell you the thing about mistakes, which we'll come back to, but I respect people who don't speak English as a first language, come to America and try and ask. I mean, I'm happy to help somebody. And yet somehow people go to another country and say, oh, I'm afraid I'm going to be wrong. I don't want someone to correct me, so I don't want to be thought stupid. And so therefore, I'm not going to do anything. I just read a book about the growth mindset, about the difference between somebody who says, I'm okay with being wrong if I'm moving forward, if I'm getting better, if I'm growing. But there are an awful lot of people in the world who say, no, I am where I am, and I need to protect where I am. And that means not being wrong, because being wrong is bad. It reflects badly on me. Whereas a growth mindset person says, being wrong doesn't reflect badly on me. It reflects, in a way, good on me, that I'm trying to get better. So let's start with trying to speak the language. And by the way, I said this before we started recording, that you've got to have some examples of this from your time in Germany. Didn't you minor in German?
I guess what I did was a double major would be, but would be the equivalent.
International business in German?
I did international business for my MBA, but I did business German for my bachelor's degree. And basically, I learnt business in German. So it was when we had economics lessons in German. It's not that easy.
Not that easy.
Yeah. And I also have qualifications in Italian. I can speak some Spanish. I can read Dutch because you can speak German. Learning one language is incredibly useful because you are able to comprehend other things, just because languages, especially in Europe, are very well related. And so learning one helps you learn a lot of others.
All right. So try to speak the language.
So one of the things we hear sometimes, or one of the things I've heard in the past, is where there's been a team or a group of people, maybe a few teams together, and one group of people don't speak the same language as the others. So in the US, it might be a team that's mostly American, and there's some Spanish speakers who prefer to speak in their first language, which is Spanish. In Europe, it's often Middle Eastern or Far Eastern languages that people prefer to speak their first language because it's easier to communicate that way, especially if you're talking to someone else for whom that is their first language. But what happens is the people who speak the majority language tend to say things like, I don't trust them. They're off in corners and they're saying something. I don't know what they're saying.
And it's terrible to admit, but that's exactly what my experience has been. And the assumption is that because they're not choosing the language that you can understand, they're saying something they don't want you to understand, which is wrong in many cases. People don't go to the corner of the room 80% of the time and talk about you in a foreign language in a deleterious way. They don't do that. My guess, people are generally good, and they're talking in a language that they can communicate in much, much faster, much more easily, much more facilely. But that doesn't change the perception.
Yeah, we've had it sometimes when we've been working in hotels for conferences, and the staff that are resetting the room for us are speaking Spanish to one another, and they're probably just having a conversation about where they're going tonight and who's doing what and what's going on with the family, the same as any set of workers do when they're doing something that doesn't take their brain and they're having a conversation at the same time. But there's just something about being the odd person out, or hearing people have a conversation that you cannot be part of, that instantly kind of makes us suspicious. And so if you are that person who speaks the other language, and maybe you're the only American and you're in Saudi Arabia and everybody else is speaking Arabic, and you're on the phone to someone and you're speaking in English and nobody else understands it, they're going to be suspicious about what you're saying. It seems to be a natural human instinct. And so if you then attempt to speak their language, it's not just about communicating words. It's about the fact that you've tried to make a bridge to get between the gap between you.
Yeah, and the next time they hear you on the phone, when talking to them, to use their words, their language, their idioms, and so on, as a form of respect, by you respecting them, you will garner respect in return. And the next time they hear you using your own home language on the phone, they will be less likely to believe that you are doing something untoward. This is really about trust building, and it's about relationship building.
Trust is based on communication, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And none of this, for the people who are worried about making mistakes, none of this is conditional on how good you are. It doesn't matter if you can only say a few words. It doesn't matter if you mangle a sentence. It doesn't matter if you conjugate the verb incorrectly. If you're getting your meaning across, even if you're not getting your meaning across, which has on multiple times happened to me, the fact that you're making an attempt is what matters, not how good you say.
Well, folks, just think about your experiences where someone who is from another country and is trying to communicate with you and doesn't speak your language and you don't speak theirs, and trying but not using any words you understand. And you want to help them, perhaps, as opposed to the person who tries very hard and says, I may not get this right, or I apologize, and uses some of their words and some of your words, even just some of your words, allow you to begin to ask questions in some broken form of middle language between the two that you can get your point across. And you may still not be right. But again, it's all about trust. As I've said many times, one of my favorite business book titles is The Speed of Trust. If there's no trust, I have to check on everything and I slow things down, which in today's world, you just can't do. And there's also the issue of cultural stereotypes, right? I mentioned ugly American, which is actually an interesting story, but I'm saddened, frankly, by the industry of teaching people that people from different parts of the world are different. People, in my experience, having been virtually everywhere, are no different anywhere. We have different customs, which are behaviors that are ingrained into the civilization that is slightly different in, say, China from Australia, from Japan, from the US, from Canada, from Mexico, from Brazil. But that's not culturally different. And the fact that you don't know the difference between the number of kisses on the cheek in France or Italy is not a cultural faux pas. It is completely okay. It's, of course, better to study those kinds of things. But I'm surprised by their stereotypes, and they're a form of bigotry that, the German who is correct and accurate and supercilious, and the American who's ugly. I think the polite Dutchman would be correct, or the reserved Brit, which I think you still hold on to, by the way. But having lived in the U.S. for quite a while, we want you to try to speak the language because it shows respect. And respect gets more communication, which builds more trust. And in a professional environment, more trust is going to be more effective. Speaking the language in another country is about respect for others, communication, trust, which leads to effectiveness, period. And the opposite of it is basically rejecting communication, effectiveness, respect, and trust. See how far you get in that world. So next thing you said was use all the opportunities.
And the best thing about being abroad, it's like everything around communication. If you want to practice communication, you're in luck because there's people all around you that you can communicate with. And when you're in a foreign country, there's people all around you who probably speak the language that you're trying to learn. So if you're staying in a hotel, you can talk to the hotel staff. Now, some of these people will try to speak English to you, but if you say, I'm practicing or I really want to learn, they'll stop. Sometimes people are as interested in learning English as you are in learning their language. And so you come to a bit of a fight, but you have to work that out. And maybe they can speak English and you can speak the whatever the foreign language is.
The classic example of hotel, I've always told people this. I remember telling one of my staff years ago when I was traveling internationally with him, I said, look, the hotel is a great place to practice. He felt that he knew no German. We were in Frankfurt, and I knew some German, was helping us get by. I'm sure now, I promise you, Wendy, the next time I go to Germany, I'm going to meet one of our many listeners or fans or clients, and they're going to say, you said once you speak German. You're horrible at it. I'm like, well, okay, I'm not at zero. And this person said to me, he says, well, what if I say something to the managing director of this particular facility and, it's wrong? I said, okay, fine. I do that all the time, so don't worry about it. And he'll probably be dismissive of you, and it will make things a little bit harder. But if we're being paid to give guidance and recommendations, you can't sit there mute because then he's not getting any value. Here's what I said, though. I said, you're worried about talking up a level or two levels and the perception of you. Fine. Those conversations are going to be harder. Think about it from a role perspective. That managing director, who is, our boss's boss, perhaps, is expecting us to be knowledgeable and so on because he outranks us. Rank makes a difference. But when we're at our hotel, we're staying at a nice hotel. I think we were staying at the Gravenbruch Kempinski, actually, which is a wonderful hotel. And I said, everybody here at the hotel works for you. Everybody. They are going to try to speak to you and help you because you, if you'll pardon the expression, outrank them. Even the concierge, who probably speaks 12 languages and would look down his nose at us privately and perhaps appropriately so, will still, because of his or her rank, relative to us as customers, will work with us and will try and will smile. Now, he may privately go back, have a smoke with his friends and say, stupid Americans, but I've benefited. And that's his issue, not mine, that he's going to have separate conversations about us. If your boss in another country or the ranking person it doesn't speak your language or speaks your language as a second language and you feel badly, fine. Practice on people whom you outrank. And guys, please don't write me and tell me, oh my gosh, I can't believe you outrank waiters. No, but I'm paying them for a service, and generally waiters, concierges, hotel staff, maids, restaurant workers, front desk workers because of the nature of vendor and customer, I outrank them. The customer is always right. And I found that, and even in public places, I was much more comfortable trying things because I would learn more and be a little bit better with a person who ended up outranking me.
Hotels have other guests. You can say good morning, good afternoon, and if you're really at the beginning, good morning and good afternoon are the places to start. You can read the magazines that are or the hotel facilities, those kind of things that are in the room that are just left in the room. If you look at the words, often those things they give you a lot of clues because there's a lot of context. And so, if you can see something that maybe looks like swimming pool and it says 9 to 5 and you must wear a bathing costume, you could probably guess some of those words and that will help you later on. You can watch television in a foreign language. I recommend children's programs. But, anything where you're listening to the language, you start to hear the rhythm and the cadence and the tone that can help you with your own learning, your own pronunciation and so on.
And when people look at you, if they don't travel abroad, and you say Guten Morgen, which doesn't sound very German, but is technically correct, they're going to look at you and you can either perceive their look as, oh, he's a foreigner, which, oh, by the way, you are, and they're looking down at you, or they know in that moment, you're not German, you're not Swiss. They get it, okay? But I got to tell you, I run into people all the time in U.S. hotels, and they say, good morning, and it's very clearly accented. English is not their first language, and I'm thrilled they're trying.
Yeah, that's right. Often in international hotels, the notices are both written in the language or multiple in European languages, in Europe, most languages, and also in English, which is another place, because you can see both. It's like a bit of a Rosetta Stone. It helps you translate things. And then once you leave the hotel, there's opportunities everywhere. And they're low risk because if you speak to a shopkeeper or a taxi driver or a waitress or whoever it is, or you ask the time of someone in the street, you are probably not going to see that person ever again in your lifetime. So there's no risk. You might get it wrong in the moment, but it's literally momentary because, you're never going to have to face that person again.
Yeah, practice all the time. And we don't have it here, but gee whiz, it's so easy to go and learn the 50 most likely phrases. If you know a month in advance, which is generally true in international travel, if you're a newbie in international travel, you're going to know a month in advance that you're going. 15 minutes twice a week, and you'll have memorized the 50 most common phrases. Buy Rosetta Stone, for heaven's sakes, but there's all kinds of apps for your phone that are just a few dollars or free that you can learn the 50 most likely phrases. Heck, I've been in countries where the app that allows me to take a picture or use the video on my phone to show a sign and then translate the sign for me real time. Come on. I mean, that gives you a chance to understand what the English is, and then there are going to be 3 or 4 words there, and you're going to be able to try. And I would submit, a la my point earlier about German and where the verb is, that if you get the verb out of place, nobody will care. They will struggle a little bit, but again, they'll be appreciative of the struggle.
I came home one night. I rented a small apartment in a family home. It was kind of like what I would call a granny annex, a separate piece from 2 elderly people who were lovely to me, the married couple. And I came home one night and the husband said, how was your day? And I was like, ugh. And he said, what's the matter? And I said, my bike has a frying pan. and all he did was laugh because the word for frying pan and the word for flat tire are similar, and I got them mixed up. And he died laughing. And, when he told me what I'd said, I died laughing too. It's just no big deal.
Well, look, I was running once in a suburb of Frankfurt, having finished a long work day. And, not many people run, well, nowadays, but this is 30 years ago. I was running and somebody saw me. And the assumption is, as far away as I am from the hotel in a residential neighborhood, not downtown, that I'm a local. And a German couple was walking by and said, blah, 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 right? At the speed at which they could talk to a German because they assumed I was a German. And my answer was, and I had the phrase, Entschuldigen Sie mir bitte, which means please excuse me, or I'm sorry. I started virtually everything I said with that. And then instead of saying, I don't speak German that well, ich spreche Deutsch nicht so gut, I said, Sie sprechen Deutsch nicht so gut. I said, I'm sorry, you don't speak German very well. And it looked at me funny. I said, Entschuldigen Sie mir. And then I said, stupid American. And they laughed. And I said, I'm sorry, I don't live here, right? And they were like, oh, it's okay. And I heard them laughing for another 100 meters. And, again, I don't mind if people make mistakes with our language. But I admit, I don't like when people come and don't try at all. The key is here not to not make mistakes. The key is to practice. And by definition, practice is about making mistakes.
And the next point on our outline was watch and listen. And the other advantage of being in a foreign country is that there's people speaking that language all around you. And so you have lots of opportunities to watch. And the way children learn is to watch adults. They watch them to work out what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. They watch and listen to find out which words work. And of course, being two, they push all the boundaries and use the wrong words. But it's that looking for clues that you can use even as an adult that helps you become more confident with the language. It doesn't necessarily teach you anything about which words are correct, although sometimes it does, or pronunciation or anything, but it gives you a confidence that there's a way of communicating. It's all to do with that cadence and rhythm and tone. And if you're getting that right, a mispronunciation becomes less important.
And if you go in thinking you're not going to try to learn the language, you won't do that. You won't listen. Mm-hmm. You won't learn, and you'll be stuck at zero.
And often what we learn is very formal language. So like you said earlier, Guten Morgen, which is a fairly formal way of saying good morning. Where I lived in Germany, they spoke Plattdeutsch, which is a dialect, and good morning was Moin Moin, which doesn't sound anything like Guten Morgen. And so for the first little while I was there, I would say Guten Morgen and look very formal. And then after I listened to everybody else, nobody else was saying that. They were all saying Moin Moin. So that's what I started saying. And so you can kind of pick up those more relaxed pieces of language by listening to. And it helps you with pronunciation too, in that
Agreed. Yep.
Some voices are easier to listen to than others. Some people are better at the way they pronounce things. It's more repeatable from some people than others. There's just something about the way different people speak that sometimes it helps you understand, oh, that's what's different, that they're pronouncing the emphasis on one syllable and not the other. Just sometimes different voices help you do that.
Yep.
And we talked about mistakes being inevitable.
Right? Yeah.
and about Alex. And look, I think I said earlier, it's not how good you say. I heard myself say it. Like, I can't speak English some days, and nor can, we all have problems with our own language. I mean, figuratively and literally are not the same word, and yet how often do we use literally to mean figuratively?
And I'll tell you, the mistakes, just forgive yourself the mistakes, because it literally, figuratively, regardless, irregardless, irrespective, think about the jokes that rely on puns or timing that you'll never get unless you're really close to fluency. I remember being in a meeting outside Stuttgart and saying something, I leaned over and said, Entschuldigen Sie, I didn't get that. And they looked at me and said, you wouldn't. It's okay. And I'll explain it later. And of course, the translation was less funny. I got why it was funny to the group, but they didn't mind. And the guy actually said to me, you know what, that's actually better than you laughing, because I knew you wouldn't get that.
Yeah, there's that kind of like laughing when you're joining in and everybody knows you don't know what's funny.
Exactly. Yeah. So we make mistakes in our own language. That means we're going to make mistakes in theirs.
Yeah. And what's more, they're making mistakes in their language too.
Yeah. The key here is the way to get better is not to not make any mistakes. The way to get better is practice. And that means making mistakes. And as people have heard me say before, good, better, best. Never let me rest until my good is better and my better best. You don't have to be perfect tomorrow. The standard is not fluency. The standard is better than yesterday. Mm-hmm. If you're here in my country for a week And by the end of the week, I notice that you put together a full sentence correctly, or you use a word that on Friday that you heard on Tuesday and you asked for a definition of it. I'm thrilled. I'm willing to work with you. Why? Because you've shown me trust and respect and have tried to communicate with me in a way that makes sense to me. If you spend the whole week and you never try because you're afraid, I'm going to say, well, there's a person who's not a growth-oriented person. There's a person who's not interested in getting ahead. All this is in my head, by the way, but that affects our relationship.
And a person who's not willing to really connect with me and communicate with me.
Yeah.
The last point we have is treat it as a game. And people often worry, we've talked a lot about mistakes, that they worry about speaking other languages. There's this, incomprehensible mystery, which it really isn't. There's lots of clues that you can get from different things so that it's not a mystery. Or they worry about saying the wrong word and insulting them or insulting a person. And when you think of it that way, you're tense and anxious and you don't want to practice and you don't learn anything. So think of it instead, one way I think of it is to think of it as a code that I'm trying to crack. So if I know the word for orange, can I look on a menu and work out what the words for orange juice are? And it can be that simple. And you're just kind of trying to put different pieces of information together to help you add to your vocabulary, add to things.
Yeah. You say orange. If you know the words for good morning, you could probably work out, if you're trying to win the game, and the game is a board game where nobody dies, you could probably figure out what the words are for good afternoon and good evening. Here's the way I always did it. I mean, I always thought, rather than seeing my hosts, and everywhere I've ever been, people are wonderful. Everywhere I go, people are great.
Absolutely.
It's like Jimmy Buffett says, you take your weather with you. And I discovered that they weren't trying to withhold from me some secret knowledge. They were happy to share their language. And so I would say to a colleague, I know the phrase for good morning, guten Morgen, but I don't know it for good afternoon or good evening. And guess what? They'd tell you. Be like, oh, and they'd say, oh, guten Abend. I said, oh, okay, guten Abend, good. And guten Nacht. Okay, I get that. And then the next time I use it, it's 7:00 in the evening, and I say to somebody, guten Nacht, which is wrong because good Nacht is the equivalent of good night as opposed to good evening or good afternoon. And guess what? I got corrected again. But now the sting of getting it wrong and the laughing about getting it wrong and hopefully doing it with a colleague who forgives me, I'll never forget it because learning is tied to the emotional state.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and if you try it in restaurants and you kind of are trying to work out what menus are, you'll end up with a few odd meals. There was a guy in Fredericksburg who I ordered pasta in Bella Pasta. And I ordered the pasta and the waiter went away and then he came back and he said, are you sure that's what you want? And I said, I think so. He said, because the chef has never made cream sauce and tomato sauce and pesto sauce for pasta in the same plate. And I was like, okay, that's not what I asked for at all. Let's start that again. But, even if I'd have got it, it'd be a bit odd, but, I wouldn't have died.
When I used to live in Texas and Wendy lived near me, we would sometimes have lunch together at Mamacita's restaurant, a great family Mexican restaurant. And we made her always ask the waiter for water because the waiters could not understand her British accent at all. And it became a joke. And even better was to be there and to ask her for water on Saturday as opposed to water on Saturday, all because of pronunciation.
The trick is to ask for iced water.
There you go. Now there's context and they know what's coming.
And and there's a little chance for them to get it. And you learn that by having people go, what did you ask for? 50 times.
Yeah. If you're not an American and you come to America, you could ask for tea and you could use the absolute correct word for tea in one part of the country and get something completely different.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. When you ask for tea in New York, they'll probably bring you hot tea. Or you could ask for sweet tea and what they'll give you is tea with sugar next to it, as opposed to in the South, if you ask for tea, you're going to get sweet tea.
It's cold.
Yeah, it's cold. Of course it's cold. That's what they drink there. And you might think, oh, I'm not learning the language. Sure you are. Even some Americans don't know that. They come from New York down to Birmingham and said, I'd like some tea. And they get a gigantic 18-ounce tumbler full of tea, and they take a sip and say, "What is this?" And it's iced, and oh my gosh, it's sweet. It's sickly sweet. And the guy from Birmingham was like, "Yeah, isn't it great?"
Yeah.
So yeah, and something else, guys. Don't go to France. One phrase, omelette du fromage. You want a cheese omelet. You can't go to a foreign country and not try to experience as much as you can and eat one thing that you know, right? Just because you know how to say it. Shoot, I know a lot of people who say, I go in a restaurant and say, I ask the waiter. Now, I don't do that. But you're not going to get a dish that is perhaps your favorite if you're in a foreign country, if you ask the waiter. But what's the worst thing that can happen? Like you said, right? You're going to every once in a while get a meal that's not great. All right. You and I could talk about this for hours. And it's almost sad that both of us are on here because I know you're quite good with languages. I used to love languages, have lost most of my German, lost virtually all of my Russian, should know Spanish and don't, living in California and Texas. And this is a reminder that I should get better.
We all should.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Wendy.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. That's it. Come back next week. We'll see you then.
Career Tools produces actionable guidance for professionals every week. To receive additional materials via our newsletter and to find products for situations you may face, go to www.managertools.com. Search for Career Tools on Twitter and LinkedIn.